Hello, everybody. I'm Marty Rosendale, CEO of the Maryland Technology Council, and this is the live Capital M ZoomCast. The Capital M podcast was originally created to further the regional conversation around capital markets, to define issues, identify solutions, and build consensus to drive change. Our focus these days has been on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the regional response. Our ZoomCast today is brought to you by GlaxoSmithKline, who's been delivering over 2 million vaccine doses per day in over 160 countries, and sponsored today by Alexandria Real Estate and Pfizer. The Maryland Technology Council is the industry trade association representing technology and life science companies throughout the state. Together with our members, we're improving the business climate in Maryland and helping companies that save, secure, and improve lives around the globe. Before we get started today, I have a few housekeeping items that I want to bring to your attention. First of all, your microphones are currently on mute. However, if you have questions, you'll find the chat and Q&A icons. They should be at the bottom of your screen. I will be monitoring both the chat and the Q&A during the discussion today. So if questions come up that make sense to respond to during discussion, we can do that. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll also have a Q&A time as well. This ZoomCast is being recorded and it will be made available for others to watch or listen to in the future. So thank you all for joining us this morning. I really appreciate it. My guest today is Dr. Leonard Friedland. Dr. Friedland is the Vice President and Director of Scientific Affairs and Public Health for GlaxoSmithKline Vaccines. Dr. Friedland, thank you so much for joining me today. We appreciate your time and the work that you're doing in the response to COVID-19 and on vaccines in general.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to speak with you today.
So, Dr. Friedland, I know that we have a lot of information to cover today, but before we get into it, could you take just a minute, tell us a bit about your background and why are you so passionate about vaccines and immunization?
Well, thanks. I mean, we could talk about this forever. So I'm a pediatrician by training. I did my residency at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia back in the late 80s. I went on and specialized in pediatric emergency medicine. And during those formative years, I had a real strong appreciation for the power of public health and for prevention because I was on the front line of caring for sick people. And of course, there was tremendous exposure to, well, if we can just prevent disease, we would be in such a better place. And I also was extremely fortunate at my work at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and then at Temple University in Philadelphia. And then in that I was surrounded by many people who were instrumental in the field of vaccinology. At the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, I had the opportunity to work with Stanley Plotkin, who, among other things, was the innovator behind the rubella vaccine and many others. Working with people like Paul Offit, who is a real leading force in vaccine advocacy. And then in Philadelphia, there's a rich history of vaccine development at the Wistar Institute and of course at Merck Research Laboratories with the work that Maurice Hilleman did, discovering more than 40 vaccines and improving patient lives. And then I moved on to Cincinnati Children's Hospital as a junior faculty member and had a research program looking to develop diagnostic assays to prevent infectious disease. But as I was going through this time frame, I got to see firsthand the power of vaccination. Just as one example, in 1987, when I was a first-year resident, we had a disease that was rampant in the United States and around the world, known as HIV, Haemophilus influenza type B. 20,000 cases a year in the United States. 1 in 200 families was impacted by this disease of young children that would result in meningitis, sepsis, and had a fatality rate of somewhere on the order of 2 to 3%. And then in December 1987, the FDA licensed the world's first conjugate Hib vaccine, which was incredible. Within a year and a half to 2 years, Hib disease was virtually wiped out in the United States. It was an absolute miracle to see how a technological innovation could completely change clinical practice. And then I got to see these miracles happen again with the introduction of Streptococcus pneumonia vaccines, with the introduction of varicella vaccines, rotavirus vaccines. I was seeing my clinical practice change for the better because people were not coming down with infectious diseases that resulted in tremendous morbidity and mortality. And so as I went through my career at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, I came back to Philadelphia, working in the inner city, again, seeing the importance of prevention versus treatment. And I had the opportunity back in 2003 to join GSK as a vaccine research scientist and take this passion into actually getting involved in vaccine development, really rolling up my sleeves. And I've had a remarkable experience in the last 17, 18 years, been involved in the development of more than 16 vaccines that have come to the marketplace in the United States, and everything else that we're doing in development, and have had really the honor to work with the vaccine community in academia and in government and industry. We all work together to advance patient health. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic is a real example of how partnerships, collaborations, all can come together to move things forward.
So Dr. Friedland, your prominent leadership in vaccine development has also got you involved with HHS and some of the international work that's looking at vaccine development for COVID-19 and immunization in general. Could you take a minute and tell us about that involvement?
Yeah, so I've been fortunate to serve on a number of national vaccine advisory committees here in the US, and US work, of course, the US is the leader, so the world follows what we do. I was the industry representative member on the FDA's vaccine-related biologic product advisory committee. We call it the VRPAC, and the VRPAC used to be sort of an obscure group that not many people would know about, but it was the advisory committee for the FDA on vaccines. Today, everybody knows of this committee. They don't know it by its name, but this is the committee that we hear about in the news that's going to be reviewing the COVID vaccines before they are authorized and offering advice back to the FDA. So I served on that committee for a number of years and then rotated off. And then 4 years ago, I joined as the industry member on the National Vaccine Advisory Committee, which is the advisory committee for the Assistant Secretary of Health at Health and Human Services. And that's been a really fantastic experience working alongside all of the colleagues in the vaccine community who are looking to give advice to Health and Human Services on where the US government should be putting its vaccination priorities. And there we get to look at issues around vaccine confidence, issues around inequality in vaccination. And the COVID-19 pandemic has really highlighted the inequalities that we see in our healthcare system and the disproportionate impact that infectious diseases can have on minority populations. We've been able to focus in on issues around technology and innovation and communication. Very, very important we think about how are we going to communicate to maintain confidence in vaccination. And we'll talk about that with COVID as well, how we can make sure that the public has the information and it's being communicated in a way that is transparent and also is understandable. And it's fantastic for me personally to be involved in this work because I get to represent all the people that I work with the patient at heart. And the other thing that's really fascinating in this work is to see how innovation is coming about. Of course, in Maryland, you're a tremendous technological hub for creativity, advancing science, and everybody coming together to take knowledge and then translate it to patients. So it's a fantastic space to be because there's so much power and so much good that we can all do and bring together. So it's been a real joy and really a privilege to be involved with this.
That's great. So first of all, thank you for your leadership. So to state the obvious, Dr. Friedland, vaccines are in the news today. We're hearing about short development times. We're hearing about different vaccine formats, RNA, viral vectors, protein-based. Could you take just a minute and talk us through the vaccine development process and the various technologies that we're hearing about and help put it in perspective for us? And I think you have some slides.
Yeah, so I can absolutely talk about the vaccine development process and the technologies. Before I get to the technologies, let's just focus for a moment or two on the development process because everybody hears about the shortened timelines now. So the way that drugs and vaccines are discovered and then developed for clinical use we tend to run them through what we refer to as the 3 phases. So it's actually, there's the first phase, which is before phase 1, and that's the preclinical work. So that's the discovery of the drug or the vaccine, testing it in cell systems and in animal models, looking at evidence of safety profile and evidence of what we would predict would result in efficacy. But then as we move into human studies, we have phase 1 work, which is a small number of patients looking particularly at safety. And then as we move into phase 2, there's work around looking at the dose and the schedule and refining the actual dose and the schedule, and then increasing safety information. And then as we move into phase 3, these are what we refer to as the pivotal studies. These are the ones that would result in the data that would be judged by the regulators to judge if the drug or vaccine is safe and effective in the intended patient populations. And typically, we take our time moving through these phases, building and building and building evidence. And then typically when we get to that phase 3 timeframe and we have a good sense if the drug or the vaccine is going to be effective and safe, that's when the manufacturing piece of the puzzle really comes into play, and commitments, monetary and capital investments are made in manufacturing to make sure that we can produce the drug or vaccine in a way that meets all of the quality assessment and quality control needs to make sure that we're giving and producing a consistent, safe, and reliable product. This does take time, but as we see, we can do things faster without cutting any corners and without compromising safety. And so what's happened in the setting of COVID, where time is not on our side, because the pandemic, as we know, it doesn't respect timelines. Here, the phases of development, we would take less time moving from phase to phase. We would take quicker decisions to move forward. We could combine phases so that we didn't have to stop and start. We can just quickly move through without cutting any corners. But the real time saver here is on the manufacturing side. And here I give Operation Warp Speed tremendous call out for the work that they did there, because Operation Warp Speed helped vaccine manufacturers make commitments for manufacturing at risk. The risk here was that vaccine will be produced before we would know if the products were safe and effective, and we could start manufacturing early at risk. And the risk there was that maybe the drug or vaccine wouldn't be effective, and then we would be producing product that would never get used. And that was essentially, that risk was taken off the table. The government helped manage that risk. They said, we'll make this financial commitment, and if 1 or 2 or 3 products don't make it, that's okay. It's worth, that was worth the money that would be lost, because we could move things faster by having product available. And it was a very, very smart decision, because now we've seen the results, and I'm sure we'll talk about it later, that have come from the first 2 vaccines, the mRNA vaccines from Pfizer and Moderna. They have been shown to be highly effective and have a very acceptable safety profile, and products already starting to be produced. And so now we have at least initial product up front. It's going to be increasing over time. And so we've been able to save time because we've de-risked on the manufacturing side, and we've been a bit more nimble and quick in making decisions about advancing through clinical program phases. So with that in mind, though, what are we working with? And that's around the various technologies here. And so I'm going to share my screen for about 5 minutes and just go through a few things with you. And let me just bring this up on this piece here. And so if we look to vaccine technologies, so vaccines, what they do is we aim to expose the body to what looks like an infectious disease. We mount an immune response to something that we think is a real disease, but it's not. It can't cause disease, but our body thinks it's seeing the pathogen. We mount an immune response that can then block that virus from making us sick if we ever see the virus in the future. So we basically build up an army in reserve should we ever see the enemy in the future. That's sort of the general concept around vaccination. And there are at least 8 different types of vaccine technologies that are being tried right now to develop vaccines for SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes the disease we know as COVID-19. And they fall into these 4 categories, and I'll go through each of them briefly with you. They're the whole virus category, the protein-based category on the bottom right, and then the 2 newer technologies, the viral vector technology and the nucleic acid technology. And let me just describe these briefly for everybody to sort of put it into perspective, because you actually know these technologies. Our children, we as adults, have received vaccines using the whole virus technology and the protein technologies. And so what I'm showing you here in the middle is a picture of a cell. And the cell is going to be exposed to, in this case, a weakened virus. And so what's the process here? We can take a pathogen, let's call it measles, or let's call it SARS-CoV-2. We can take that, we can grow it up in culture, and then we can weaken it. We can, what the word for weakening is attenuating. We can attenuate or weaken the vaccine through passage in what we call cell cultures, so that we end up with a weakened virus that can cause disease in the human body, but the body still says, aha, I see you. I'm going to create that army to fight you if I ever see you again. And that process, we know, because that's what's in our measles, mumps, rubella vaccines that we use today. That's what's in our chickenpox or varicella vaccines that all of our children received when they were young. And that's what's in our rotavirus vaccines that are given to infants. That is the attenuated, weakened virus technology. We can also grow up the pathogen, and instead of weakening it, we can actually inactivate it. We can kill it with heat or with chemicals. And we know that technology as well in vaccines that we're using today. That's in our inactivated polio vaccines. That's what's in our hepatitis A vaccines. And that's also the technology if you ever need to get a rabies vaccine. And the idea is that we give this weakened or inactivated virus to the human body. It's taken up by our cells of what we call the innate immune system. They're the monocytes, the macrophages, the dendritic cells, and then they're taking up, and then the antigen presenting cells, the dendritic cells, will process the virus and essentially break it apart inside our cells and then express proteins. If it's the case of COVID, it would be the coronavirus peptide, such that it can then be delivered to an arm of our immune system called the adaptive immune system, where we can create long-term memory through the production of antibodies and a cellular immune response to the virus. And this approach is being used to develop SARS-CoV-2 vaccines. However, growing a virus in cell culture and then weakening it or breaking it apart is a laborious, time-intensive activity. It can take months, if not years, to do this well. We don't have that luxury of time for SARS-CoV-2. And so while groups in Asia and other groups are developing vaccines for SARS-CoV-2, for coronavirus 19, with these technologies, they're not in late stage development here in the United States. We just haven't had the time on our side to develop these weakened or attenuated viruses. But this technology is tried and true. And as you know, your measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox, varicella, polio, hepatitis, these technologies result in highly effective and safe vaccines. So that's one technology. Another technology that we know today, we use this in clinical practice, is what we refer to as the protein-based vaccines. Instead of taking the entire pathogen and weakening it or breaking it apart, what if we just select out a particular piece of the pathogen that's the antigen of interest? And that would be the protein of interest. And it was the recombinant protein technologies that came about for vaccines beginning in the 1980s with the hepatitis B vaccine that really revolutionized the production of these protein-based vaccines that typically have adjuvants added to them. And so here the process is we can select the protein, we can have an expression system like yeast become the factory and make the protein, and then we can formulate it in a vaccine. And that's the technologies that we use today with our hepatitis B vaccines, with our human papillomavirus vaccines, the HPV vaccines, the shingles vaccine that's recommended for all people over age 50, and a vaccine for meningococcal serogroup B. These are all protein subunit adjuvanted vaccines, and it's the same approach. Here, instead of giving the whole pathogen, we essentially give the protein to those cells of the immune system that process the protein and then present it to the adaptive arm or immune system to make that long-lasting immune response. This technology is being used today for SARS-CoV-2. There's a program right now that's about to start in phase 3 program from a company right in your neighborhood. Novavax is using this technology to develop a COVID-19 vaccine. And at GSK, we're using this technology as well in collaboration with Sanofi Pasteur, with another company called Medicago and another company called Clover. But this takes a little time as well because we need to make that protein in this cell system and then formulate it in a vaccine. But we can do things even a little bit faster to make vaccines that can go into clinical trials. And that's what happened with COVID. And that's by using this technology, viral vectors, and then the next technology I'll get to, the RNA vaccines. And here what we can do is we can take a delivery vehicle, that being a non-pathogenic virus, and we can use that non-pathogenic virus, which could be a measles virus or a cold virus like adenovirus. And we can use that as a delivery vehicle and put inside this viral vector the sequence of interest for the coronavirus spike protein. And then that viral vector, and viral vectors are very quick to grow in cell culture media. And we can use it as a platform, and we can literally take the vector and insert this new sequence, SARS-CoV-2 spike protein, deliver it to the human body. Then the cell takes up the vector and then has the instructions to make the SARS-CoV-2 protein, which is taken up by that antigen presenting cell and then can drive the adaptive immune response. This technology is only available in the United States currently with an Ebola vaccine that's in the US stockpile. And so this is a new technology that has great promise, and we're starting to see very good results coming from groups like Janssen and AstraZeneca who are using this technology. There was a report today in the Lancet of the immune response in phase 2 to the AstraZeneca viral vector program for SARS-CoV-2. And then the other technology that we hear about and has been in the news with outstanding results from Pfizer and Moderna is using nucleic acid technology. So nucleic acids are the instruction sheets for making proteins and other important things in our bodies. This is the instruction for how to make proteins. We can take that instruction, and instead of making the proteins outside of the human body in a factory, we can use the human body as the factory. So we can deliver the DNA, or we can deliver the RNA, that sequence, to the human body, where it's taken up by those cells of the innate immune system. The viral proteins are then made because we've given the instruction sheet to the body, and then those viral proteins are taken up, the peptides are expressed. There have never been an mRNA or a DNA vaccine license for human use. However, the results from the mRNA vaccines that we've heard in the last 2 weeks from Pfizer and Moderna are extremely, extremely encouraging with their data. And they will be likely the first vaccines that will be authorized to help detect against COVID-19. This is a revolutionary technology. Many groups are using RNA technologies for vaccine development, including our teams at GSK as well. And it's absolutely fascinating and an important, critically important breakthrough where we can essentially develop vaccines fast because we don't need to grow cells in cell culture. We can literally give the instruction to the human body to make the vaccine. So Marty, these are the technologies that are underway. As we can see, the nucleic acid and the vector technology can produce vaccines very, very quickly, but then we take the standard process, which we can now use even faster, which is going through those phases of development and also the manufacturing piece. so that we can deliver vaccines to everybody in the United States and around the world. And we're on the verge of doing that. So I'm going to stop my screen share and bring it back to you.
Great, thank you. So that was great. Thank you for that. Now, you mentioned the time to development and how that has changed. A year ago, if anybody asked me what does it take to develop a new vaccine, I would have said 10 years and $1 billion. Now, the $1 billion seems to still be holding, but the 10 years appears to be 10 months based on all the efforts that are going into this. And as you mentioned, some of these technologies are newer technologies. We've heard in the news that there are groups that are concerned about whether they should take the vaccine or not. What do you say to somebody who is worried about the safety of these vaccines as we're developing them?
Safety is not being compromised in the way that these vaccines are being developed. The results that have been reported in the last 2 weeks from the two mRNA vaccines from the companies Pfizer and Moderna, the Pfizer study enrolled 44,000 adults. The Moderna study enrolled more than 30,000 adults. That's in the order of the number of patients that we typically have in large development programs for new classes of vaccines. What's a little different here is that typically we follow patients for a much longer period of time in our clinical trials, a year, if not 2 years of safety follow-up. We simply don't have that luxury right here because the benefit of protection outweighs the judgment of risk, given the tremendous impact that COVID-19 disease is having on our population here in the United States and around the world, especially in high-risk groups of patients such as frontline healthcare workers, essential workers, the elderly, and those with underlying comorbidity. And so the benefit of having a vaccine with large numbers of patients with short-term safety collection outweighs the risk. However, that doesn't mean that safety assessments are going to stop. We are incredibly fortunate that in the United States, we have incredibly robust safety monitoring programs for vaccines run by the Centers for Disease Control, the FDA, and other groups in real-time safety surveillance. And so as individuals are going to be vaccinated, as the vaccines become authorized and implemented in priority ranking, these traditional safety systems will all be in play, plus some additional ones that are going to be added right now, including a program called vSafe that the CDC is going to be implementing, where people who receive the initial vaccines, they can enroll in a mobile app where they can report every day their safety experience. And so we'll be collecting safety data in real time. And should there be any potential signal that's developed, I'm extremely confident that both the manufacturers of the vaccines will be able to know that that's happening, and the FDA and the CDC and the academic community and other branches of the US government, and will adjust accordingly. Everything is pointing to that we shouldn't have any concerns around this, and we'll continue to monitor. My biggest concern is the issue of confidence, that individuals will be confident that these vaccines are the right thing to do for their health and for the health of our society. And there we need to have systems in place, and I believe they're going to start to be coming now, around how we're going to communicate the information that we're collecting, sharing it with the public on a very regular basis with consistent individuals who can be trusted. Transparency is absolutely going to be critical here, because the only way we're going to solve and tackle this pandemic is to continue with the non-pharmacological interventions that we are all doing and should be doing more of: wearing masks, washing our hands, social distancing, and getting people vaccinated. We need to have large proportions of our society vaccinated so we can stop this pandemic. And that's going to be around confidence. So I'm not concerned about the safety. I personally will get vaccinated as soon as I can, based on the way the CDC rolls out their prioritization. I'm going to recommend it to my friends and families. but we need to make sure that people feel that it's the right thing to do. And that's going to require a really important effort from the entire vaccine community, including the US government, to share that information, because corners are not being cut here. What we have is tremendous advances based on innovation that's going to result in improvement in patient care.
Great. So, Dr. Friedland, a couple of questions have come in that I think are pertinent to this part of the discussion. So I want to bring them up. And first, I want to remind everybody to please use the Q&A function or the chat function. We are monitoring it while we're talking here. So first of all, Dr. Friedland, the question has been asked, do we have your permission to share your PowerPoint slides?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, good. So anybody who would like that set of slides, just reach out, send an email to the Tech Council, and we would be happy to share those slides with you. So another question has come in with respect to the nucleic acid vaccines, and I'm going to paraphrase a little bit here, but given that it's a new technology, is there anything in specific with respect to the long-term risks that you and other scientists are going to be watching for?
Well, with any new technology, we have to continue to build the evidence around the experience, and that will continue to be done. Everything that I've seen to date says to me that benefit outweighs potential risk. And as more and more data becomes available, we'll have ever-growing experience. These are the natural instructions that we have in our human body. We're just helping the human body, make the proteins. And so I'm confident that we have the right systems in place to continue to follow this technology. But of course, as new things are introduced, it's very rational to have our own internal questions. And we need to look at benefit versus risk. And I'm quite confident that systems are established and in place that will be able to continue to grow the evidence base and continue to make informed decisions. But one thing that this technology is doing here is that it shows how science and knowledge of human immunology, genetics, and using all of our fields of science can come together to address a problem. And it should be raising confidence in vaccination in general. And I think that's really, really critically important, because I think the world now sees what the world is like when we don't have a vaccine or highly effective therapeutics to manage an infectious disease. And along those ways, it reminds me to say that let's not forget what we already have. We have a whole variety of vaccines that can prevent vaccine-preventable diseases for use for people of all ages here in the United States and around the world for that matter. And what we've seen during the course of this pandemic is something that's been extremely disturbing. Vaccination rates have dramatically declined for people of all ages since March. If we look to children, there have been more than 9 million doses of pediatric vaccines that would have been expected to have been given in the last 8 to 9 months that have never been given. How are we going to catch these children back up to get those 9 million doses of vaccines against polio, hepatitis B, human papillomavirus, HIB, the list goes on. It's been missed. And then if we look to adult vaccination, dramatic declines in adult vaccination, 60-70% declines in adult vaccination for pertussis, for shingles, for pneumonia that have occurred. And we need to get everybody caught back up on all the vaccine preventable diseases that are recommended. We don't want to have outbreaks of measles happening in the United States, or people having to go to the doctor's office or the emergency department because they have a case of shingles when because they didn't get their recommended shingles vaccine, or people presenting with pneumonia because they didn't get their streptococcus pneumonia vaccine. And of course, with influenza, we're right now in influenza season. On any given year, only 50% of adults receive their influenza vaccine, and we absolutely need to make sure that we have high rates of influenza vaccination this year, so we don't overwhelm our healthcare systems with people with influenza disease. And so we need to make sure that we take this opportunity to recognize the importance of vaccination and keeping ourselves healthy. And so we're eagerly awaiting the COVID-19 vaccines to be authorized and then recommended and implemented. Let's also take advantage of saying technologies can help us stay healthier. And we already have vaccines available for people of all ages. Let's make sure that we all get completely up to date and take care of ourselves so that we don't have an added public health crisis with outbreaks of vaccine preventable disease on top of COVID-19.
That's a great message, Dr. Friedland. I know my wife has had shingles, and I can tell you that we currently keep up to date on our shingles immunization and our influenza. But I hadn't thought about the children that aren't getting vaccinated with the childhood vaccines right now. And that's definitely something that we need to figure out how to get caught up on. There have been a number of other questions come in, but I think I'm going to hold them to the Q&A because there's a couple of other topics that we want to touch on. One of the questions really is a pretty good segue to the next topic that I wanted to touch on, which is you talked about these new technologies and the speed at which we're bringing the COVID vaccine to market. Do you think that this is going to stick? Is this these new development methodologies, this rapid process, is it going to be a part of the norm going forward beyond the pandemic?
I say yes. What we've seen now is extremely disruptive, and disruption can be very, very powerful because it makes us rethink what we're doing. But I do have a concern. While we have the technologies and we can do things in different ways that can result in real benefit, if we don't have confidence along the way, if we don't have procedures in place to implement these programs, particularly around funding for emerging infections and being prepared to manage this, then it's not going to result in benefit. So it's not the technologies that are the issue any longer. It's going to be the will of society to put power and recognition behind prevention. We live in a society where we value treatment over prevention. And it's not just for infectious diseases, it's for everything, right? It's our blood pressure and cancer screening and so forth, right? Our medical system, particularly in the United States, is valued in many different ways on the treatment side versus the prevention side. And so I hope what happens is that this disruptive technology that we're seeing and this new way of thinking places greater emphasis and recognition on the value of prevention, and that we can put in place procedures and processes that value that so that we can move these things through. There's a tremendous amount of money that's been devoted right now to the biotech sector around COVID-19, which certainly is being seen in the Maryland biotech sector. So how is it going to, we need to sustain it, keep it going, because we can see what innovation can do to solve problems, but we don't want this to be sort of, when this fades, that we forget about it. Let's take this opportunity to put new procedures in place that value prevention and that value vaccination. So one of the things I was thinking about earlier was that our society hasn't in the past really valued vaccination. People understand we've had vaccines that can prevent diseases, but we didn't place a lot of value on it as a society. But now we see how important it is to place value on this. And so I'm very optimistic that this is going to be maintained, that we're going to see more funding, more money, more talent want to be involved in prevention side of medicine and public health versus the treatment side of public health. And I hope that our government continues to place more emphasis on this as well, because we see what technology and innovation can do, what people power, what brain power, what passion can do to solve problems. It's extremely exciting what's happening in the Maryland Tech Corridor with the work coming out of AstraZeneca, from from Novavax, from where I work at GSK, and many, many other biotech companies. It's pulling in people who are fascinated by this area. They're devoting their time and their attention. They see the opportunities, and I hope that it sustains. And I'm optimistic that it will, because we see what human will and human knowledge can do to advance health. It's extremely exciting, and I'm very optimistic that it's going to be sustained. I tend to be an optimist, but I'm fairly confident that this is going to be, there's a silver lining behind this tremendous public health crisis. So we need to keep focused, solve this issue, but then keep it going.
That's great. I tend to be an optimist as well, Dr. Friedland, and I see, at least I think I see in younger generations, a much greater interest in wellness and prevention. And so I'm hopeful that as they come up and become the leaders and executives going forward, that we will see that transition. So I'm optimistic about that as well. You mentioned earlier when we were talking about diversity and inclusivity.
Mm-hmm.
And we've certainly seen with COVID-19 that it has impacted some minorities more highly impacted than other groups and other populations. In the vaccine development process, what can be done, what is being done to make sure that we're being inclusive and that we're covering all those populations?
That's a really, really great thing to ask about and for us to talk about. So as mentioned, I've been involved in the development of more than 16 vaccines that have been licensed for use in the United States. And as we were conducting the clinical trials for all those vaccines, we always struggled to have adequate representation of all the people in the United States represented in our clinical trials. And it wasn't just GSK who would struggle with this. It was every group developing a vaccine. In fact, every group developing drugs. We all struggle for this. And there's so many reasons why it's very difficult to have people enroll in clinical trials that are representative of our diverse population. And we've seen, however, now that it can be done. The results that have been shared now from both the Pfizer and Moderna, the two companies with the mRNA vaccines, they're the first to really share their data because they're the first to have completed their phase 3 enrollment targets. They've been sharing in real time the enrollment in their studies of people of diverse backgrounds, race and ethnicity, and they've been able to do it. And so it can be done. And I'm very optimistic that we now have identified new ways to actually make it happen. But we have a lot of work to do here. There's tremendous, and I understand it, hesitancy for segments of our population to trust the healthcare system and the medical system. The legacy that we have in this area is not something that we should be very proud of. We all know many of the issues that have occurred over time. And so we need to continue to build trust in this area. And I'm very, very hopeful that as the results are published with the COVID-19 vaccines, and we can show that patient populations who enrolled in our studies, that these drugs and vaccines are safe and effective in those particular patient populations, will be a real area where people can wrap their arms around and say, yes, this does apply to me. And we need to make sure that we're transparent and proactively sharing this information. And I think that in the past, when we said we couldn't do it, we've tried, but we failed, that's not acceptable any longer. We know we can do it. And this is going to be the new way forward. And I think that's a tremendous, tremendous advance, especially when we have, if we think to, it's not only COVID-19 that has disproportionately impacted people of color and other certain patient populations, underrepresented minorities for this disease. If we look to something like the disease human papillomavirus, HPV, for which we have a highly safe and effective vaccine available here in the United States and around the world, African-American patient populations are disproportionately impacted by HPV in disease. And so we need to make sure that we have data in those patient populations. If we look to the setting of a therapeutic drug, if we look to a disease such as systemic lupus erythematosus, SLE, lupus, shortly as we call it, again, a disease that disproportionately impacts African-American populations in the United States, we need to have data specifically generated in those patient populations so we know, not that, number one, so we know it's safe and effective, but also the patient populations themselves say, the data was generated that's relevant to me. So I think we have come a tremendous way in the last 7, 8, 9 months in addressing these issues, but that's in development of drugs and vaccines. On the other side, that we need to address this in society as well. Why are these diseases disproportionately impacting these patient populations? What can we do to improve access to healthcare? Issues around healthcare delivery. It opens up an area that we can no longer hide from, and we need to absolutely address. And hopefully we're going to see progress here, because I started off by saying I'm a pediatrician. I went into the field of medicine because I believed then, and I still believe today, that every patient deserves the same level of care, regardless of who they are. Every patient deserves the exact same level of care and access. And so I think this dialogue is really important, because it's opened up a real important wound that we really need to address, because unfortunately, the reality is that not every patient gets the same level of health care. There's a lot of issues, including unconscious bias, that we all need to understand and address so that everybody can benefit, because everybody deserves to benefit from the innovations that are here and are coming.
Great, thank you. So, Dr. Friedland, we're coming up. We've got about 10 minutes left, and this may be more of a statement than a question, but I do want to bring it up and get your thoughts. You mentioned collaboration early on, and the collaboration around COVID-19 has been amazing around the world. Here in Maryland, we have seen over 40 companies that have come together in the response to COVID-19. We formed the Maryland COVID Coalition. Companies came together to work with one another. GlaxoSmithKline very early on announced that they would make available any of their adjuvants to companies that were working on vaccines, which was an amazing offer, I thought, and certainly indicative of the kind of collaboration that we're seeing. What are your thoughts around this level of collaboration, and is this something that you think is going to stick and become more customary?
I think the answer is absolutely yes. So in the beginning of my academic career, the sort of approach that was taken in academia was that everybody would sort of work in their own silo, and it was their work, and it was your team that advanced things. But as we've moved on, it has to be across and collaboration. No one group can do it all, especially in the era of needing of bioinformatics and processing information around systems vaccinology and systems biology. And so everybody recognizes now that collaboration and taking expertise and pulling it all together is a very, very effective way of solving problems and advancing healthcare. And so in the setting of COVID-19 specifically, while many groups have developed their own technologies and are moving them forward, we see collaborations everywhere. And we see groups that would traditionally be competitors, healthy competitors, are collaborating. And so speaking to the work that we've done at GSK, for those who may not be aware, GSK Research and Development in Vaccines is probably the world's leader, I would say, in the development of adjuvants for vaccines. Adjuvants are substances that can enhance and shape the immune response to a target antigen. You know some of the adjuvants in the GSK R&D work in the vaccines that we use to protect, for example, shingles in people over the age of 50. And we have an adjuvant that we also have studied in the setting of seasonal influenza with H1N1 back in 2009 and H5N1, where we have another adjuvant system called ASO3 that was used for seasonal and pandemic influenza. And it was shown that this adjuvant could have a characteristic which we refer to as antigen sparing. In other words, you could have less quantity of antigen per dose, so you could get more doses out of your yield. And when we looked at this, when the pandemic started back in the January, February, March timeframe, we realized there's 7 billion people on the planet. That's a lot of vaccine doses that would be needed. If we could be part of collaborations to produce vaccines with antigen sparing, we can get more doses out of the yield, and therefore more doses could be available to more people sooner. And so what we did is we said, we have this adjuvant system that we think can help as part of this solution. Who could we work with their proteins? Because other groups were more advanced in their developing their coronavirus spike proteins. And that's the collaborations that we have currently with Sanofi Pasteur, with a company called Medicago, another company called Clover, and others as well, where together groups that we would typically healthy compete with, we're collaborating because it was the best way that we felt that we could take our science and expertise and knowledge and work with other groups with their science, expertise, and knowledge and move things forward so that more people could potentially benefit sooner. And it's fascinating. So when we heard this from our leaders at GSK, that this was the approach we were taking, we were like, wow, that's fantastic. That's exactly what we should be doing, because that's the way the world works now. If we collaborate together, we can solve problems. And so we're very, very proud of this work. And we're seeing other groups do very, very similar things because the public health needs this. And if we all work together, we can advance things even faster, more effectively, more efficiently. And in the setting of COVID, because we're coming to the end, I do want to say that the world needs many solutions here with therapeutics and with vaccines. No one or two vaccine manufacturing companies can provide enough vaccine for 7 billion people around the planet. We need multiple winners here, multiple vaccines, and it looks like that's where we're heading. The data suggests that the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein is the right antigen. The vaccine programs that I talked about before with the vectors, with the DNA, with the protein, they're all targeting the same protein. It's very optimistic that there'll be many vaccines available in the future to help protect people all around the world. And many of them are going to come through collaborations. And that's a great thing. And the same thing, by the way, is happening on the therapeutic side. At GSK, we're partnering with a biotech company called Vir, based out of California, where we're working with them with their knowledge of monoclonal antibodies. They're working with us on our knowledge of vaccine and drug development and our knowledge of immunology. And together, we're moving forward. And there are many other examples of these collaborations. And that's the beauty of also the Maryland Tech Center. There's also tremendous expertise in manufacturing in your sector, because it's not enough just to develop a vaccine. It has to be manufactured and distributed, and a tremendous need for expertise in the implementation and the manufacturing and the delivery phase as well. And thankfully, there's tremendous expertise with Emergent and other groups in your sector that are working here as well. And partnerships are really the way to go.
That's great. I agree. I think collaboration is the way of the future, and I'm very hopeful that this level of collaboration will stick. So it looks like we only are going to have time for one or two questions, and there's two people have asked a question here that's very similar. So I'm going to kind of paraphrase both questions, and that is with respect to the different technologies, mRNA and protein vaccines. Does one have advantages over the other? Is it likely that the mRNA vaccines are going to replace the protein vaccines when we look to the future? So I guess this is a question you need to get your crystal ball out and kind of look, what does the future for immunization and vaccine look like?
So when I look to the future, I see a future where many different technologies will be utilized because they all have potential advantages and they all can result in opportunities to improve patient health. And so some of the advantages of the mRNA and the vector technologies right now is speed in developing a vaccine that can get into clinical trials. We have great experience with the use of protein vaccines in the way to use structural vaccinology to fix proteins in a particular manner. And we can do that through protein vaccines and also through the nucleic acid vaccines. And so they all offer opportunities. I see many different technologies being utilized. There's also issues around storage and distribution, the temperatures at which vaccines need to be kept. All the technologies have sort of different ways of looking at that. And I see all of these technologies being used because sometimes, for example, we may need more than one antigen. We may need the whole pathogen to be utilized. So all the technologies are going to be used and move forward. And that's exciting because it creates tremendous opportunity for bringing talent acquisition into this field. We're going to need bioengineers because it's one thing to make the vaccine, it also has to get delivered to the right place in the body. And bioengineers are getting ever increasingly involved in helping deliver the payload to the right place at the right time. So that's critically important. We also need to look at other technologies such as how they're delivered. Right now, most vaccines are delivered through the muscle in an injection. There's great optimism around vaccines that can be delivered through patch technology, oral technology, intranasal delivery. So bioengineers and chemists and others will get involved in that aspect of understanding how to manipulate the immune system in the right way through different vehicle delivery mechanisms. So I don't see any disadvantages or advantages of one over the other. I see that they're all in the mix, and we just need to find the right way of doing it for the right disease. And that's going to be ever increasingly important. Just because things are old doesn't mean they're not good. We are still utilizing the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine that's been around for decades because those vaccines are highly effective and they utilize what we would now refer to as traditional technology. So the old doesn't mean that it's not good. We need to take the old and the new and find the best approach for the particular disease. And we also need to make sure that we can deliver these technologies and these innovations to people all around the world. Because as I said earlier, and I'll just reinforce again, everybody on this planet deserves the same access to healthcare. And if we're smart and effective and collaborate together with all the groups that are involved, we can make this happen, and all these technologies can get us there.
Dr. Friedland, thank you. We could go on. I could continue this conversation for hours. I think it's fascinating. I really appreciate your time, your leadership. I want to let everybody know that Emily did put in the chat room her email address. So if you would like to request Dr. Friedland's slides, you can send Emily a message and she will forward them to you. Again, Dr. Friedland, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for GlaxoSmithKline for bringing us this opportunity to talk with you. There was a question about therapeutics, but I think we're going to hold that. We will probably put together another ZoomCast on therapeutics. So we'll hold that question for then. Just again, really appreciate your leadership, really appreciate your time today.
Well, thank you. And thanks to everybody in the tech corridor for the work that you're doing. It makes a real big difference. So thank you.
Great. If those that were listening and watching today, if you learned something, please let your friends and colleagues know about it. You can go to mdtechcouncil.com where you'll find a recording of today's ZoomCast. So thank you, everybody. And again, Dr. Friedland, thank you.
Thank you.